because I remember talking about leadership and what leadership encompasses, right? We talked about that. There's this quote from The Art of War, and it talks about leadership being comprised of trustworthiness, humaneness, courage, and sternness. Okay? So what I think is, I know we were a couple pages in to chapter 9. We're going to start fresh, and we're going to work our way through chapter 9. I know that means we're going to reread maybe a couple pages, but we'll be all right. And then Mr. Stout will issue chapter 9.1, okay? But real quick, on your mark, get set, go. Who would like to volunteer to be a spinner? Okay.
I was probably last.
To home, I'm going to let you go ahead and do it, buddy. Jump on there. Okay?
Like his fourth time.
So, hey, listen up. No blurting out. So, hey, here's the deal. You can pick a classmate today, okay? But your response has to be fairly quick, right? I don't want you to ponder for 15 minutes. Should I pick Billy? What are you doing, Mr. Seabass? Should I pick Susie? Know who you're going to pick, and you cannot pick the same person more than twice, okay? Mr. Stout's going to cut it down a little bit. And then, last but not least, if somebody's absent, who gets to make the pick?
You.
Mr. Stout does, right? Okay? So, chapter 9, the guilty. August 2nd to September 26, 1945. Leadership is a matter of intelligence, trustworthiness, humaneness, courage, and sternness. The way of the ancient kings was to consider humaneness foremost, while the martial arts considered intelligence foremost. This is because intelligence involves the ability to plan and to know when to change effectively. Trustworthiness means to make people sure of punishment and reward. Humaneness means love and compassion for people, being aware of their toils. Courage means to seize opportunities to make sure of victory without facilitation. Sternness means to establish discipline in the ranks by strict punishment. So that's the art of war. Go ahead and let it rip, Mr. Thelma. There's an extra copy sitting right on that. Okay, Miss Hannah, go ahead and pick somebody.
Miles.
Miles, nice and loud, sir. First paragraph.
Son to the art of the war. Knowing how the men in the water died is not the same thing as knowing why they died. The 317 men who were saved from exposure and shark attacks were asking, why me? Why did I live when my shipmates didn't? The relatives of the other 880 men were asking the Navy, why did this happen? Why wasn't the ship given any escort? Was the captain doing all he could do have done to prevent the attack? How could the ship go down so fast? Why weren't there more lifeboats? Why didn't anybody hear the SOS? Why didn't anybody know the ship was overdue in port? Why wasn't anybody keeping track of it? Why didn't somebody send rescue planes and ships immediately? What should the Navy have done that they didn't do?
Okay, so we did talk about this the other day. I know we read the first couple pages, but that whole section is talking about what? What's that section talking about? John?
The things that the Navy could have done.
The things that they could have done. Sometimes bad things happen, and we talked about foresight and we talked about hindsight. This is hindsight. This horrific event has occurred, and now these people, these survivors, are saying, well, what if this had been done differently? What if this had happened? Maybe this wouldn't have happened. And so they're looking back and they're reflecting upon the things that could have prevented this horrific situation. Miss Zoe, go ahead and pick somebody.
Kimberly.
What's up?
Kimberly.
Kimberly, nice and loud.
As a local assistant in our project, Mr. Scott had some of the same questions. He tried to put together a timeline of events. The more research he did, reading books and interviewing survivors, the more impaired he was. What went wrong and why was Captain McVeigh the only one punished, when clearly he was only one of the large cast of players in the drama, and among the least culpable. Deconstructing the strategy with the benefit of hindsight reveals a long series of errors and omissions, any one of which taken alone might not have meant that much, but in combination they contributed to the deaths of 880 men and changed the lives of 317 more.
Very good. Gabriella's not here. Mr. Stout gets a pick. Miss Emily, nice and loud.
I was just thinking the relatives of the men lost had a long list of things they wished hadn't happened before weren't so. If the ship had been better ventilated, she wouldn't have been sailing under conditions yoke modified, with all of her hatches open and wind stuck so fast. If the ship hadn't been rushed into service to deliver the bomb
To Tinian.
to the end, her repairs still complete, no time for a shakedown cruise, with 250 new recruits on board and over 100 passengers getting in the way. Her crew would have had more time to train and practice abandoned ship drills, and perhaps would have even loosened her lifeboats. When she sailed at top speed from Guam to Leyte to compensate for lack of an escort, instead of sailing at 15.7 knots to conserve fuel and arrive in the morning, the I-58 mine never even caught her. If she'd been equipped with sonar, she could have detected the submarine's presence and taken evasion action. If she had only been fully armored, if she only hadn't been top-heavy with radar and radio antenna.
Very good. So again, it continues. They say, well, what if this had happened? What if this had happened? If she hadn't been sailing with all her hatches open because it was so hot, maybe she wouldn't have sunk so fast. If she had had sonar, maybe she would have detected the enemy submarine, and then maybe she wouldn't have sunk so fast. If she had been given the escort that they asked for, that they requested, maybe the Indy wouldn't have sunk. Okay, so they continue to do that. There were plenty of things that the Navy did know that had been fully understood, and that might have prevented the disaster. There were, first of all, things that the Navy knew that they didn't tell Captain McFay before the Indianapolis left Guam. Admiral Spurzett, Admiral Nims, and his Chief of Staff, Commodore James B. Carter, and Captain Oliver Nacklin, and possibly his assistant, Lieutenant Johnson, at the Marinese Command, all had access to information telling them that there were at least 4 Japanese submarines active in the Southern Pacific within range of the Petty route. They also knew that an American destroyer, the escort, the USS Underhill, had been sunk on Tuesday, July 24th, 3 days before the Indianapolis arrived in Guam. Emily, you just read, but go ahead and pick somebody.
Miles.
They knew because a unit identified as Signet, short for signals, intelligence, had broken the Japanese communication code and had for some time been intercepting Japanese radio transmissions and fleet signals, identifying ship locations and movements. The top secret information Signet gathered was classified under the code word Ultra, the same name the British gave to the information they received from crafting German communication codes. One Signet report showed that the I-58 had left its base secure for general patrol on the I-367, or heading out to patrol the Marines area west of Guam. The 2 subs were part of what the Japanese were calling the Tramon group, named after one of the 4 Buddhist gods who were responsible for protecting Japan from their enemies.
Why then didn't anyone tell McFay about the sinking of the Underhill or the activities of the Timon group? Wasn't the fact that there were 4 enemy subs actively hunting in the area he was sailing through something he needed to know? In part, he wasn't told because he wasn't of sufficient rank. On March 23, 1943, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest J. King had issued a 2-page directive instructing that the special intelligence developed from Ultra be handled and distributed only by or to flag officers of command afloat, meaning admirals. You guys remember the difference between an admiral and a captain? Okay, we did talk about that. Mr. Christian, what was the difference?
Admiral is in control of a fleet of ships, and the captain is just in control of one.
Absolutely, and so we talked even earlier, in the book when we were reading, and we talked about one of the ships, they had been given a directive, they were headed on a mission, and when they saw, when they got news that there was men in the water, they aborted that mission, and they immediately turned around without any kind of permission, because they knew every second in the water was going to save lives, right? And what was something that captain said? He knew that something could occur. What was that? What could occur by him changing his mission like that?
Saving lives.
Well, yeah, obviously he's going to save some lives. Mr. John?
Court martial.
He could get court-martialed. Does anybody remember what a court-martial is? We talked about that. Mr. Stout showed you that little clip. What's a court-martial? It's a fancy word for something. Okay, Christian?
The Navy, basically, it's like court, but Navy.
Yeah, it's basically a trial, right? If you disobey orders and directives, they can hold a court-martial and you can go to trial and you can even be put in prison. I think we talked a little bit about like Fort Leavenworth. There's actual military penitentiaries, okay? However, the difference between an admiral and captain was that some of the admirals had flagships, right? And if they had a flagship, and that was their flagship, when you had an admiral on board, they could change directions at the whim of the admiral, right? Remember we talked about that word whim? What does whim mean?
It's like out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere, right? So there's definitely some differences there. Okay, who is my next year? Did it pick Miss Emily again? Emily, you are lucky today. Go ahead and pick a friend.
Avery.
Avery, nice and loud. Oh, yeah. If Admiral Sprucin had decided to sail to the Philippines,
On the Indianapolis.
yep,
Rather than fly, we made my will have been given the information about
Timon Group.
the Timon group or the Underhill because
Sprucin's.
Susan was a flag officer. Even without revealing the source of information or the reason for the woman,
Commodore, good.
Carter might have made casual remarks such as better be on your guard. Charlie, there are still depths out there. When he met McVeigh.
So I'm gonna stop right there. So they talk about prior to, the Indy delivering the, components to the atomic bomb. Captain McVeigh, he meets with some high-ranking officials, kind of in a casual manner prior to their departure. They're getting lunch, and that's another thing they're referencing. Like, what if they had just taken the time to maybe share a little bit more information? At the time, however, Carter didn't know which route the Indianapolis would be taking, and he didn't know if Admiral Sprucins would be on board or not. Anyway, Carter assumed McVeigh would be given the intelligence he needed at the standard pre-departure briefing by Lieutenant Waldron, the routing officer. Sprucins could have said something when he had lunch with McVeigh, but it wasn't an admiral's job to give intelligence briefings. And besides, he was planning the invasion of the Japanese home islands and had a lot more in his mind than backwater transits. Waldron should have told McVeigh, but Waldron didn't know because he was called to ask about an escort. He wasn't told by Lieutenant Johnson, the assistant to the Service Operations Officer Nacklin, who'd received the information on Japanese sub activity from Commodore Carter. Miss Brooklyn isn't here. Mr. Stout gets to pick. I see a lot of excited faces. Miss Jazzy, will you please read?
Nacklin charged with plotting the
A
location.
little bit louder, Jazzy.
Nacklin charged with plotting the locations and movements of all the ships, blindly or otherwise in the
Marinese.
Marinese of area control. With some of the accounts of the cautious man, maybe a defender got to be branches a order of intelligence. Some said for whatever reason he didn't pass the information on. Perhaps because Waldron wasn't a fleet officer, so he was just following orders, or because Macklin didn't put much stock in the ultra information. To begin with, there was a lot of false submarine sightings and a lot of bogus reports that never amounted to much. SIMPAC had issued a directive and that capital ships sailing from Guam to the Philippines no longer needed escorts. One reasonable interpretation that the directive would have been the capital ships could take care of themselves.
Jurisdiction.
jurisdiction. The
The Marinese Command.
Japanese command earlier in the war, a self-sighting like one reported by the SS Wild Hunter on the 28th would have been enough to divert the Indianapolis from its route, as it was Captain McRae's sail straight into harm's way without knowing it, because the system failed to give him the information he needed that neither had wreckage down. Somewhere between surface operations officer Oliver Macklin and routing officer Joseph Walden.
John Jesse. The next mistake the Navy made was sending the Indianapolis on the petty route without an escort. If the priority given to deploying escort ships in the waters closer to the Japanese main islands was correct, then ships sailing without escorts should probably have been given safer routes. As it was, the I-58 was waiting exactly where Captain Hashimoto knew he could expect Allied ship traffic, on a straight line between Guam and Leyte. It would have been possible for Simpak to have told Waldron to assign the Indianapolis to an alternative course without compromising their ultra intelligence. Perhaps the biggest mistake the Navy made was losing the Indianapolis in the middle of the ocean. A ship sailing on a straight line at a known rate of speed should not have been that difficult to track, and yet an unlikely sequence of mechanical failures, human errors, innocent assumptions, and short-sighted policies led to that result. It wasn't unusual, for example, for a flagship to change course without notifying anyone, because a flagship served at the whim of the flag admiral who used it. Combatant ships, in general, sailed rather independently. The Indianapolis had sailed many times and changed course many times with Admiral Sprucens on board, often on a straight line without zigzagging, even in combat zones, because Sprucens needed to get where he wanted to go in a hurry. It wasn't unusual for a flagship not to show up when and where it was expected. Any of the commands charged with plotting ship traffic might have concluded after the Indianapolis was overdue in port that McFay had received orders they didn't know about and headed off in some other direction. So, serious show of hands, how many checker players do I have out there? Who thinks they can beat Mr. Stout in a game of checkers? Emily very confidently raised her hand, and I saw it like, Mr. Stout, you're going down. You guys are probably right, I'm not very good at checkers. But how about chess? How many chess players we got out there? Emily's on it again, I love it. Pretty good chess player? Okay, now here's the real question, okay? This is where Mr. Stout gets down. I know it's not Candyland, okay? Who's played Battleship? Anybody?
I'm ready.
They still have that game? Okay, I see a lot of hands. So you guys, who thinks they're the best Battleship player in the room? A few hands went down, I see Miss Foster's hand go up. What I'm getting at is, you know, if you play the game of Battleship, you kind of secretly organize your ships in different locations, right? Maybe in different patterns, maybe you spread them out, maybe you hide them at the bottom of the board. But it's kind of like a plotting grid, right? So there's so many different, positions within the military, and some people's jobs were strictly just to sit in front of these plotting boards. We talked about a known rate of speed, right? Okay, so when they gave this information, they would say, hey, we're going to travel at this many knots per hour, right? So after the atomic bomb was delivered, somebody should have been in the room and they should have been tracking the Indy, right? And that's part of the issue, okay? Is it Captain McFay's responsibility to plot the ship? Is he there? No, he's on the ship, right? So that was one of the major mistakes that kind of led to the sinking. It was also common for them to assume that no news was good news. If they didn't hear otherwise, nothing was wrong. To reduce radio chatter and to keep the Japanese from intercepting U.S. communications and learned Allied ship locations, Allied ships at sea didn't report in on a regular basis or send progress reports of how they were faring or when they thought they'd arrive. The consequence of such practice was that when they hadn't heard anything from the Indianapolis by 1100, Tuesday, the plotters at the Marinese Command and at Simpak simply assumed the Indianapolis had reached Leyte and took her off the plotting boards. That left only 3 commands waiting to hear at the other end of her transit to notice the Indy was missing. Admiral Ollendorf at Task Force 95, Admiral McCormick at Task Force 95.7, and the port director in Leyte. 1 Lieutenant Commander Jules Santos. Of the 3, the first 2 didn't notice. The the last one, notice, but didn't say anything. Why? Recall the orders that Indianapolis received from SINCPAC's advanced headquarters on Guam on the 26th, 2 days before sailing. That too late, that read. I'm gonna have you read that, John, nice and loud.
Upon completion, unloading Tinian, report to port director for routing to Guam. For disembark, 5th Fleet personnel, X completion, report to PD Guam for onward routing to Lake. Where on arrival, report CTF 95 by dispatch for duty, X CTG 95.7. Directed, arranged 10-day training for Indianapolis inlet area.
So based upon that, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say it's super coded, right? But they do use some phrases in there that you might not use in a regular conversation. What were they gonna do in Lady when they arrived? Jock, what do you think they were gonna do?
Train.
Yeah, they were just gonna do like some training exercises, was kind of the plan. It did say a few times it says they need to report to the PD. You remember what the PD stood for?
Port director.
Port Director. Very good. Ms. Kimberly, go ahead and pick somebody. I knew it was gonna be Zoe. Go ahead, Zoe.
The directive ordered McVay to sail Guam but didn't specify the date, saying only that McVay was to deport upon completion of unloading, meaning basically whenever he was finished unloading whatever it was he had to unload. The nature of what he was unloading was of course top secret because he was unloading the bomb. After that, he was to take his passengers to Guam, but the directive didn't specify when that would happen either. Finally, upon reaching Lake, McVay was to send a message saying he arrived to Oldendorf on the Omaha, then sailing in the waters off Japan. And then McVay was supposed to report to McCormick on the Idaho and join his task group for gunnery training in the Philippines. Copies of the order were sent to McCormick and the Oldendorf Point directors in the Tinian and Guam, to Admiral Murray at the Marianas Command, and to Admirals Nimitz and Spruance. However, when the message was received aboard the Idaho, the person who decoded the message wrote down that the address was CTG 75.8, not CTG 95.7. In any miscommunication, the fault may lie with the sender, the receiver, or the medium in between, and it was unclear why the Idaho's radio room got it wrong. Whatever the reason, McCormick's radio technician assumed he'd received in effect the wrong number, a message that wasn't meant for him. It was only classified restricted, not top secret. So he assumed it wasn't that important, and didn't ask the sender to repeat the message. It wasn't his problem. It was CTG 75.8's problem, whoever they were, or else it was the sender's problem.
Then at 10:40 a.m. Saturday morning, July 28th, Guam Routing Officer Waldron transmitted a second message containing the Indianapolis essential transit information. When it was leaving, when it would arrive, how fast it was traveling, and when it would cross the CHOP into the Philippine Sea frontier. Copies of the second message were sent to Commodore Carter of SINCPAC, who might still have warned Captain McVay about Japanese sub-activity now that he knew when and where the Indy was sailing. To Lieutenant Commander Sancho and Leahy, and to Admirals Nims, Spruance, Murray, McCorm, and Oldendorf. This time, McCormick decoded the dispatch correctly and learned that Indianapolis was on its way. But because he missed the first message, he had no idea why the Indy was joining his task group. He could only wait to see what was going on when she reported in. And again, because she was Spruce's flagship, chances were good that she diverted to go somewhere else. As for Oldendorf, he never got the second message. Waldron's communication went through the communication center in Okinawa. But there, for whatever reason, it disappeared. That meant that, I lost my spot there. That meant that Admiral Oldendorf knew why the Indianapolis was coming, because he'd received the first message, but not when. For all he knew, she was still unloading cargo at Tinian. In other words, neither McCormick nor Oldendorf knew what was going on, and neither was directly to blame, but neither had cause to be alarmed when the Indianapolis didn't show up. Miss Abigail, go ahead and pick somebody. Valerie? Nice and loud, Miss Valerie. It's kind of a long one. I'll jump in there halfway through.
No, that one, yeah, to the DSF or Philippine Sea
Frontier?
Frontier. And stated, calling
Longitude.
all the way to the west to Thailand, north to the
20th parallel.
20th parallel, and the south to the West Indies. The PSF oversaw the local naval
Good.
defenses, routing, dispatching, transport,
Salvage.
repair, harbor control, and routine shipping, but had little to do with
Combatant ships.
which were under the control of Admiral Thomas C.
Kincaid.
Commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet, as well as all allied naval forces in the Southwest Pacific area. At the time of the sinking, the PSF headquartered at
Also good.
on the southern part of the Leyte Gulf was ran by the Commodore Norman C. Shorty,
Gillette.
who had taken over only a few days earlier for Greece and Mayor James
Kaufman.
Coffin, who was away on leave.
Okay, I'll stop right there. Gillette's chief of staff was Captain Alfred N. Granham. Leyte Gulf operations were administered by NOB Naval Operating Base, Leyte Gulf, led by Commodore Jacob H. Jacobson, with headquarters in the town of Tacloban, a city of 50,000 people midway up the Gulf. The new port directors in Tacloban, Lieutenant Commander Jules Sancho, 42, with the assistance of his operations officer, Lieutenant Stuart B. Gibson, 35, watched over the arrivals and departures of over 1,500 non-combatant ships a month, about 50 a day, seeing there was berthing, servicing, and provisions. Both Sancho and Gibson were experienced naval men. It was Gibson who received the dispatch from Waldron telling him that Indianapolis would arrive on the 31st. Gibson noted the information in his logbook and mentioned it to Sancho, who mentioned it to Jacobson through Gibson. Sancho and Jacobson were all somewhat surprised they'd been told, because it wasn't their job to keep track of combatant ships. Guys, I know sometimes this can get a little tricky because there's a lot of different names in there. They're mentioning all these different officials, and you may not say, well, why do they keep listing all these people? I think the reason that this book is trying to kind of notate and highlight all these different high-ranking officers and officials is to show you that there was a lot of different people that were involved, and a lot of people had a little bit of this information, a little bit of this information, but the communication amongst themselves wasn't necessarily very good. One word in there that I saw that I thought was like, oh wow, that's an important word, is Miss Valerie was talking about the PSF. Does anybody remember what the PSF stood for? Christian?
Philippine Sea Frontiers.
The Philippine Sea Frontier, okay? So they mentioned that area of the ocean, right? And they said it's very vast, right? That was the word she read. I'm looking for somebody different. What's vast mean? Something's very vast, okay? Mr. Lewis, do you know what it means? Something is vast. Empty, okay, I like it. I can definitely see vast being used in that context. I'm looking for just a little bit more. Can somebody add to that? I'm looking, I'm scanning. Miss Kaylee, vast. Something's vast.
My name isn't Kaylee.
What's that? I'm sorry, Kylie. Vast. You do have a twin sister, so it's not 100% my fault. So what's vast?
I don't know.
Anybody want to jump in there and help her? Mr. Jock, what's something super vast?
It's like wide open, large.
It's massive, right? These guys were responsible for tracking like this gigantic area, right? The second two phrases, one of them is actually going to appear on your chapter 9.1, okay? I think it's on 9.1, it might be on 9.2, but it uses two phrases. It used combatant and it used non-combatant, right? So Hayden, what's the difference between a combatant ship, and a non-combatant ship?
A combatant ship is one with guns that's being actively used in the war. Non-combatant is one transporting cargo or people or other things.
Yeah, and so a lot of times they have these non-combatant ships, and they would receive something that starts with an E. It's something that the Indy requested that didn't get. What's that E phrase? I see a few hands. Tony, what's that E thing?
The escort.
An escort, right? Okay, so you guys are gonna have the rest of the period, which isn't a whole bunch of time. You guys got about 18 minutes. You're gonna work on your 9.1. If you need help, you're gonna throw that hand up. Ms. Foster and I will be circulating the room, and we will definitely help guide you in the right direction, okay? So Mr. Stout's coming around with these right now. And again, if you need help, just let me know. Here you go, Jazzy. There you go, bud. Okay, Tony, please see bud. This is always the tricky though. Good job, man. And I think I'm one short, Ms. Thomas.
In the library, right?
Oh. Yeah, am I short one of your hands, bro? Okay. Okay, guys, make sure you pull out a writing utensil and we're turned around to them. We're not talking, we're here. Okay. Did I skip you too, Mr. York? I'm sorry. Okay, guys, if you need some help, let me know.
The rest of our road doesn't have any.
Are you serious?